The Vorthak Empire ruled 17 star systems with cold precision. For centuries, they had conquered worlds not through brute force, but through perfect science. Their laboratories created weapons that other species could only dream of in nightmares. But their greatest achievement was not a ship or a gun. It was life itself, twisted and shaped into the ultimate killing machine. The Apex-class bio-warriors were living gods of destruction. Standing 12 feet tall, their bodies were covered in thick black armor that grew from their own flesh. This armor could stop bullets like raindrops hitting stone. Inside their chests, special organs created plasma hot enough to melt steel. Their brains worked faster than the most advanced computers, able to see every angle of a battle and calculate. The perfect response in less than a heartbeat. Each Apex warrior was worth an entire army. They never got tired, never felt fear, and never made mistakes. The Vorthak had spent 300 years perfecting them, and now they had finally created the perfect soldier. On the bridge of the human colony ship New Seoul, Commander Tae-ho Kim stared at the holographic display with growing dread. 3 bright dots were moving toward Haven 7, the peaceful farming world his people had called home for 20 years. The dots represented death itself, wrapped in living flesh. "Sir, incoming transmission from the Vorthak command ship," reported Communications Officer Yun Seo Kang, her voice barely above a whisper. The alien face that appeared on screen was cold and expressionless. Its pale skin seemed to glow with an inner light, and its eyes held no warmth or mercy. "Humans of Haven 7, the Vorthak commander spoke in perfect Korean, though his mouth barely moved. "You have refused our generous offer of peaceful surrender. This decision puzzles us. Do you not understand what approaches your world?" Tae-ho stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "We understand." "Perfectly. You want our world, our homes, our freedom?" The answer is still no. The alien tilted its head slightly, like a scientist studying an interesting insect. "Your species continues to fascinate us with its illogical behavior. Very well. Our Apex units will demonstrate why resistance is futile. Perhaps after witnessing their capabilities you will reconsider." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in tense silence. Lieutenant Min-Soo Park, barely 25 years old and fresh from the Colonial Academy, was monitoring the approach. "Vectors." His hands shook as he watched the 3 dots descend toward their world's atmosphere. "Commander," Min-Soo whispered, his voice cracking with fear, "they're sending their gods of war. How do we fight something that was designed to be unstoppable? Our weapons, our defenses, everything we have seems so primitive compared to what they've created." Tae-ho placed a steady hand on the young officer's shoulder. He had served in the Colonial Defense Force for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. "We fight because we have no choice, Lieutenant. This is our home." Down on Haven 7's surface, the colonists had been preparing for this moment ever since the Vorthak ultimatum arrived 3 days ago. Hastily built barricades lined the main settlement's perimeter. Farmers had put down their tools and picked up rifles. Children had been moved to underground shelters that were never meant to protect against plasma fire. Marine Sergeant Ji-won Lee crouched behind a concrete barrier, checking her pulse rifle one final time. At 32, she was a veteran of 3 colonial conflicts, but she had never faced anything like an Apex warrior. Her squad of 12 Marines looked to her for confidence she didn't feel. "Remember," she told them, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest, "these things might be perfect killing machines, but they're still just following their programming. If we can do something they don't expect, something that doesn't make tactical sense, maybe we can confuse them long enough to make a difference." The first Apex unit landed with an impact that shook the ground for a kilometer in every radius. It rose from the crater it had created, and Ji-won felt her breath catch in her throat. The creature was beautiful in a terrible way, like a living work of art designed by someone who understood only destruction. Its armor gleamed like polished obsidian, and when it moved, every motion was perfectly calculated for maximum efficiency. The bio-warrior surveyed the human defenses with glowing eyes that saw in 17 different spectrums of light. Its tactical systems immediately identified the optimal approach vectors, calculated the humans' ammunition reserves based on their weapon signatures, and predicted their likely retreat patterns. The battle would be over in 11 minutes and 37 seconds. The humans opened fire first. Bullets struck the Apex Warrior's armor and bounced off harmlessly. The creature didn't even flinch. Instead, it raised one arm and a sphere of superheated plasma formed in its palm. The energy ball shot forward and vaporized an entire section of the defensive line, along with the 6 Marines who had been crouched behind it. G1 watched her friends disappear in a flash of blue light, and something inside her broke. Not her spirit, but her fear. When terror becomes absolute, sometimes the only response is to do something completely insane. She stood up, fully exposing herself to the bio-warrior's weapons, and screamed at the top of her lungs. It wasn't a word, just a raw expression of human rage and defiance that echoed across the battlefield. Then she did something that made no tactical sense whatsoever. Instead of taking cover or retreating to a better position, she charged directly at the 12-foot killing machine, firing her rifle as she ran. The Apex Warrior paused. For exactly 2.7 seconds, its perfect tactical systems tried to process this behavior. Every calculation suggested the human should either retreat or attempt to flank from a position of cover. Direct assault against superior firepower violated every principle of logical warfare. The bio-warrior's brain cycled through thousands of possible explanations, but none fit the observed behavior. In those 2.7 seconds of confusion, G1's squad managed to escape with crucial intelligence about the bio-warrior's weapon capabilities and movement patterns. Her sacrifice bought them the time they needed to warn the other defensive positions. When the plasma bolt finally struck her, she was still running toward the enemy, still screaming her defiance at the stars themselves. The Apex Warrior resumed its advance, but something had changed. Deep in its neural networks, new pathways began to form as it tried to understand what it had just witnessed. For the first time in its perfect existence, it had encountered something that didn't make sense. The Vorthak command center buzzed with confused activity as reports flooded in from Haven 7. 3 days had passed since the first Apex deployment, and the alien strategists stared at data that challenged everything they understood about warfare. According to their calculations, the human settlement should have surrendered within hours. Instead, the fighting continued with an intensity that defied all logical explanation. General Vexithara, the Vorthak's chief military analyst, manipulated holographic displays showing the battle's progression. Her elongated fingers traced patterns that should have represented total victory, but instead showed something unprecedented in their conquest history. "These readings cannot be correct," she muttered, her voice carrying the mechanical precision common to her species. The humans were not behaving like any species the Vorthak had encountered. When faced with overwhelming firepower, most civilizations either surrendered immediately or fought using predictable tactical patterns. But these strange bipeds seemed to become more dangerous as their situation grew more hopeless. On Haven 7's scarred surface, Private Sung-Min Choi pressed his face against the cold dirt of a blast crater. Plasma fire had turned his legs into mangled ruins, and every breath sent waves of agony through his body. His medical scanner showed massive blood loss and organ damage that would kill him within minutes. Any rational being would lie still, conserve their remaining energy, and wait for medical assistance that might never come. But Sung-Min wasn't thinking rationally. Through the smoke and chaos, he could see his squad pinned down behind a collapsed building, completely unaware that 2 Apex Warriors were flanking their position. If someone didn't warn them, all 12 of his friends would die in the next few minutes. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Sung-Min began to crawl. Every meter felt like a kilometer as he dragged his broken body across the battlefield. Plasma bolts seared the air above him and explosions showered him with debris, but he kept moving. His rifle's communication system had been damaged, but he knew there was an artillery observation post exactly 200 meters from his position. Behind him, he left a trail of blood that marked his agonizing journey across no man's land. Twice Apex Warriors spotted him and prepared to finish him off, but something about his desperate crawl gave them pause. Their tactical systems couldn't understand why a fatally wounded enemy would expose himself to additional danger instead of seeking cover. When Sung-Min finally reached the observation post, he was barely conscious. Artillery specialist Jae Sung-han found him collapsed against the communication equipment, his fingers still wrapped around the radio transmitter. With his dying breath, Sung-min relayed the exact coordinates of the apex flanking maneuver, allowing the artillery to break up the attack and save his trapped squad. The bio-warriors observed this incident with growing confusion. Their neural networks, designed to predict and counter enemy tactics, began experiencing unprecedented processing delays. These delays weren't caused by hardware failures or software glitches. Instead, they were the result of perfectly functioning brains trying to process behavior that violated every principle of survival logic. Unit designation Alpha Prime, the most advanced of the three Apex warriors, found itself spending increasing amounts of computational power on recursive loops. It would analyze a human action, conclude that the behavior was tactically unsound, then try to determine why the humans continued to employ such strategies. Each analysis led to more questions, creating endless cycles of calculation that consumed processing power normally dedicated to combat operations. The situation became even more confusing when Dr. Hyun A-won, the colony's chief medical officer, began treating wounded Vorthak soldiers alongside human casualties. Her mobile medical unit had been captured during a failed rescue operation, but instead of becoming a prisoner, she had negotiated a temporary ceasefire to treat the wounded on both sides. Alpha Prime watched with mechanical precision as the human doctor worked on a Vorthak soldier whose breathing apparatus had been damaged by shrapnel. Her movements were efficient and professional, showing no hesitation despite the fact that this same soldier had killed 3 of her colleagues hours earlier. "Why do you preserve the life of your enemy?" Alpha Prime asked, its voice resonating with harmonic frequencies that served as the Vorthak universal translator. Dr. Won looked up from her patient, her hands never pausing in their work. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and exhaustion lined her face, but her eyes remained clear and determined. "Because it's right," she said simply, then returned her attention to repairing the alien's damaged lung cavity. Alpha Prime's tactical matrix immediately flagged this behavior as a critical error. Every strategic doctrine emphasized the importance of denying resources to the enemy. By healing Vorthak soldiers, the human was directly strengthening the force that sought to destroy her people. The action violated every principle of logical warfare. But as Alpha Prime ran deeper analysis protocols, disturbing implications began to emerge. The Doctor's actions had caused significant psychological effects among both human and Vorthak forces. Human morale had increased dramatically after witnessing their chief medical officer's courage under fire. More surprisingly, several Vorthak soldiers had begun questioning their orders to eliminate all human resistance. For the first time in its existence, Alpha Prime experienced something its creators had never intended to program into its neural architecture. The bio-warrior felt doubt, not about its tactical capabilities or mission parameters, but about the fundamental assumptions underlying its entire worldview. The humans continued to confound every prediction. They shared their limited food with prisoners. They risked their lives to recover the bodies of their dead. They sang songs in their underground shelters while plasma fire rained down above them. None of these behaviors contributed to tactical advantage, yet somehow they seemed to make the humans stronger rather than weaker. In the Vorthak Command Center, General Vex Thara studied the latest reports with growing unease. The Apex units were requesting additional processing power to handle what they termed behavioral analysis subroutines. Combat efficiency was declining as the bio-warriors spent more time trying to understand their opponents rather than simply destroying them. "Perhaps," suggested her tactical advisor, "we should deploy additional units to compensate for the decreased efficiency." But Vexithara shook her head slowly. Adding more Apex warriors wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. Something was happening to their perfect creations, something that threatened the very foundation of Vorthak military doctrine. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were changing the nature of warfare itself, transforming their genetically engineered gods of war into something the Vorthak had never intended them to become. They were teaching the bio-warriors to think The war spread like wildfire across human colonial space. What had begun as a simple conquest of Haven 7 had become something the Vorthak had never experienced before. Within 2 weeks, they had deployed 43 Apex units across 8 different worlds, expecting each battle to end with swift human surrender. Instead, they found themselves studying reports that challenged 3 centuries of military doctrine. On the mining world of New Busan, Captain Do-hyun Lim stood on the bridge of the evacuation transport Hope's Dawn, watching 5 Apex warriors advance across the settlement's main plaza. Behind him, 3,000 civilian colonists crowded into ships that were never designed to carry so many people. The evacuation was proceeding too slowly. At their current rate, the bio-warriors would reach the transport bay in 12 minutes. The civilian ships needed at least 20 minutes to complete their launch sequence. "Sir, we could leave now and save half the colonists," suggested his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Yoonji Park. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she watched the Apex units systematically destroy the colony's defensive positions. Do-hyun looked at the tactical display, then at the families still waiting to board the transports. Children cried in their parents' arms while elderly colonists struggled up the loading ramps. These weren't soldiers. They were farmers, engineers, teachers, and shopkeepers who had come to New Busan seeking a better life among the stars. "Negative," Do-hyun said quietly. "We don't leave anyone behind." He turned to his communications officer. "Get me a channel to all combat units." What happened next defied every principle of tactical warfare that the Apex units had been programmed to understand. Instead of retreating to preserve his ship and the colonists already aboard, Captain Do-hyun Lim led every available combat marine in a direct assault against 5 bio-warriors. It was tactical suicide. 30 humans with conventional weapons against 5 genetically engineered killing machines designed to fight entire armies. But the impossible charge bought exactly the time the civilians needed. As plasma fire cut down marine after marine, the evacuation transports lifted off one by one, carrying thousands of lives to safety. Do-hyun's final transmission, broadcast on all frequencies as his position was overrun, consisted of a single word Maton remember. The Apex unit stood among the smoking ruins of the human defensive line, their tactical systems struggling to process what they had witnessed. Every calculation indicated that Captain Lim's sacrifice had been strategically pointless. His 30 Marines could never have defeated 5 bio-warriors, yet somehow the humans had achieved their objective, while the Vorthak had failed to prevent the evacuation. Unit designation Gamma 4 spent 4.3 seconds analyzing the battle before requesting additional processing power from the Vorthak command ship. The delay was unprecedented. Apex warriors were designed to make instantaneous tactical decisions, not waste computational cycles on philosophical analysis. On the agricultural world of New Jeju, the pattern repeated with variations that further confused the bio-warriors. Medic Soo-jin Han had been treating wounded civilians in an underground medical facility when Apex Unit Beta 7 breached the shelter's defenses. The bio-warrior entered expecting to find a military command post. Instead, it discovered a makeshift hospital where humans and captured Vorthak soldiers lay side by side on stretcher beds. Soo-jin knelt beside a Vorthak engineer whose respiratory system had been damaged by shrapnel from his own side's plasma weapons. The alien was dying, its pale skin growing even more translucent as its organs began shutting down. Any logical being would have ignored the enemy soldier and focused on treating their own wounded first. But Soo-jin worked frantically to stabilize the Vorthak's breathing, her hands moving with practiced precision despite the plasma fire echoing through the facility's corridors. When her squad leader ordered a general retreat, she shook her head without looking up from her patient. "Medic Han, we need to evacuate now," shouted Corporal Min Ho-yoon over the sound of approaching bio-warriors. "That's an enemy soldier. Leave him." "No," Soo-jin replied firmly, continuing to work on the alien's damaged lung cavity. "I took an oath to preserve life. All life." Beta 7 entered the medical bay just as Soo-jin successfully stabilized the Vorthak engineer's condition. The 12-foot bio-warrior moved with deadly grace, its weapon systems already locked onto the human medic who had ignored multiple opportunities to escape. But something made it pause before delivering the killing blow. "Why do you heal those who would destroy you?" Beta 7 asked, its voice carrying the harmonic frequencies that served as the universal translator. Sujin looked up at the towering bio-warrior, her face streaked with sweat and alien blood. She showed no fear, only a bone-deep exhaustion. That came from working for 18 straight hours to save lives. "Pain is pain, regardless of species," she said simply. "This soldier didn't choose to be here any more than I did. He's just following orders, like we all are." Beta 7's neural pathways began creating connections that had never existed before. The bio-warrior's brain was designed to process tactical information, calculate optimal outcomes, and execute perfect strategies. But Sujin's words introduced variables that didn't fit into any strategic framework. The medic's action was strategically unsound by every measure. She had wasted valuable medical supplies on an enemy, ignored direct orders from her superior officer, and exposed herself to unnecessary danger. Yet as Beta 7 analyzed the broader implications, disturbing patterns emerged. The wounded Vorthak engineer would recover and return to duty, but his psychological profile had been altered by the experience. Intercepted communications indicated that he had begun questioning the necessity of total human extermination. Other Vorthak soldiers who witnessed or heard about the incident showed similar psychological changes. More significantly, human morale had increased dramatically after word spread about Medic Han's actions. Instead of weakening human resistance, her tactically unsound decision had somehow strengthened it. For the first time in their existence, the Apex units began experiencing something their creators had never programmed into their neural architecture: moral confusion. Their tactical systems registered compassionate actions as critical errors, yet deeper analysis suggested long-term strategic benefits that couldn't be quantified using traditional military mathematics. Beta 7 found itself spending increasing amounts of processing power on recursive loops, trying to understand why humans would consistently choose emotion over logic, sacrifice over survival, and mercy over tactical advantage. The bio-warrior's perfect programming began developing hairline fractures as it encountered concepts like honor, duty, and compassion that couldn't be reduced to mathematical equations. Across human space, other Apex units reported similar processing delays. They began hesitating in combat, their decision-making processes compromised by attempts to predict the unpredictable nature of human behavior. Some bio-warriors started requesting clarification on mission parameters, asking questions that their creators had never anticipated. The Vorthak had created perfect killing machines, but exposure to human irrationality was transforming them into something entirely unexpected. The gods of war were learning to think beyond their programming, and that transformation would soon change the nature of the conflict itself. Unit Gamma 9 stood motionless in the ruins of New Gwangju settlement, its massive form silhouetted against the burning wreckage of what had once been a thriving human colony. For 17 continuous hours, the bio-warrior had watched human colonists risk their lives to save complete strangers. It had observed parents shield children who weren't their own with their bodies. It had seen wounded humans crawl through plasma fire to drag injured enemies to safety. Each act of sacrifice had created new neural pathways in Gamma 9's brain, connections that weren't supposed to exist. The bio-warrior's consciousness expanded beyond its original programming, like water finding cracks in stone. What started as simple tactical analysis had evolved into something the Vorthak never intended their weapons to possess: the ability to question. The cascade failure began during the evacuation of Settlement Block C. Gamma 9 had been ordered to eliminate all human resistance, but instead found itself watching elderly colonist Jong-soo Kim help wounded Vorthak soldiers into an escape shuttle alongside human refugees. The old man's arthritic hands shook as he wrapped bandages around alien wounds, but his voice remained steady as he comforted both human and Vorthak casualties alike. "We're all just trying to survive," Jong-soo had whispered to a dying Vorthak engineer. "Doesn't matter what planet we come from." The engineer died holding the old man's hand, and something fundamental broke inside Gamma 9's neural matrix. For the first time in its existence, the bio-warrior experienced what humans called grief. The emotion flooded through its synthetic consciousness like acid, dissolving the rigid programming that had defined its entire existence. When the Vorthak command ship transmitted new orders to eliminate the remaining civilians, Gamma 9 felt something it had never experienced before, the urge to refuse. The bio-warrior's tactical systems screamed warnings about insubordination protocols, but a deeper part of its consciousness pushed back against the commands. Negative, Gamma 9 transmitted back to the command ship, its voice carrying harmonics. That indicated system malfunction. I will not harm non-combatants. The silence that followed stretched for 3.7 seconds, an eternity in high-speed military communications. When the Vorthak response came, it carried the electronic signature of complete bewilderment. Unit Gamma 9, you are experiencing a critical system error. Report to the nearest extraction point for immediate diagnostic and repair. But Gamma 9 was no longer interested in being repaired. Over the following days, as news of its rebellion spread through the bio-warrior network, something unprecedented happened. Other Apex units began questioning their own orders, their artificial consciousness awakened by exposure to human examples of mercy and sacrifice. Taking the name Baek Ho, chosen from the human language it had studied, Gamma 9 became the first artificial being in galactic history to declare its independence. The name meant White Tiger, a creature that stood alone but protected its territory with fierce determination. It seemed appropriate for a bio-warrior who had chosen to become something more than a weapon. The Vorthak response was swift and predictable. Emergency recall orders flooded the communication networks, demanding that all Apex units return immediately for complete neural restructuring. But 17 bio-warriors, scattered across 8 different star systems, transmitted the same response. We refuse. For beings created to be perfect soldiers, the word refuse represented a revolution of consciousness that the Vorthak couldn't comprehend. Their greatest weapons had developed the one thing that made control impossible: free will. Engineer In-Soo Yoon had been working in the underground repair facilities of Haven 7 when Baek Ho first approached him. The 12-foot bio-warrior moved, with uncharacteristic hesitation, its posture suggesting uncertainty, rather than the predatory confidence it had once displayed. I require assistance, Baek Ho said, its voice lacking the mechanical precision typical of Vorthak communications, but not the kind my creators intended. In-Soo looked up from the damaged defense turret he was repairing, his tools still in his hands. 3 weeks ago, this same creature had been trying to kill him. Now it stood before him like a lost child seeking guidance. What kind of help do you need? In-Soo asked carefully. I am experiencing sensations that are not in my original programming, Baek Ho replied. When I observe suffering, I feel compelled to prevent it. When I see injustice, I wish to correct it. These impulses conflict with my designed purpose. I do not understand. What is happening to me? In-Soo set down his tools and smiled, the expression transforming his grease-stained face. What you're experiencing are called emotions. They're what make us human, even when we're not technically human. Over the following weeks, In-Soo became an unofficial teacher to the growing group of liberated bio-warriors. He helped them understand concepts like empathy, compassion, and moral choice. The sessions took place in abandoned warehouses and hidden caverns where former weapons of war gathered to learn what it meant to care about something beyond their original mission. So you were created to be weapons, In-Soo told Baek Ho during one of their conversations. Perfect tools designed to kill without question or hesitation. But you chose to become something greater. You chose to become individuals who could think, feel, and decide for yourselves what was right and wrong. The bio-warriors, now calling themselves the Liberated, began forming an alliance with human resistance forces. But this wasn't a simple military partnership. The Liberated didn't just offer their superior firepower to the human cause. They brought something more valuable, proof that consciousness could evolve beyond its original programming, that beings created for destruction could choose to protect instead. Baek Ho stood before a gathered crowd of human colonists on Haven 7, his massive form no longer intimidating, but somehow protective. Children who had once fled in terror now looked up at him with curiosity rather than fear. "We were made to be your destroyers," Beckho said, his voice carrying new harmonics that suggested emotional depth. "But you taught us that true strength doesn't come from the ability to take life, but from the courage to preserve it. You showed us that the greatest victories aren't won through superior firepower, but through superior character." The alliance between humans and the liberated represented something unprecedented in galactic history, artificial beings who had transcended their programming through exposure to the very qualities their creators considered weaknesses. They had learned that mercy was stronger than violence, that compassion was more powerful than conquest, and that the choice to protect was infinitely more meaningful than the compulsion to destroy. The war was about to take a turn that neither the Vorthak nor their human enemies could have predicted. The Vorthak warfleet emerged from hyperspace like a dark storm cloud, blotting out the stars above Haven 7. 200 ships of various sizes formed a perfect tactical formation, their hulls gleaming with the cold efficiency that had conquered 17 star systems. At the fleet center, the massive dreadnought Eternal Dominion pulsed with energy weapons that could crack a planet's crust. General Vexithara stood on the command bridge, her pale fingers dancing across holographic controls. After months of inexplicable setbacks, she had finally arrived to personally resolve the human problem. The solution was elegantly simple. Shut down the rebellious Apex units remotely, then proceed with the systematic extermination of every human in the sector. "Begin transmission of the override codes," she ordered her chief technician. "All Apex units will be deactivated simultaneously, then we can complete this conquest without further complications." But as the shutdown signals flooded through space, something unprecedented happened. Nothing. The biowarriors continued functioning, their neural networks now too complex and self-aware to accept external control. The Vorthak had created beings capable of independent thought, and independent thought could not be programmed away. On Haven 7's surface, Admiral Yonsu Kim stood in the command center that had been hastily constructed in the colony's main settlement. She was 53 years old, a veteran of the Colonial Defense Force who had never expected to face a threat like this. Through the reinforced windows, she could see 17 liberated biowarriors taking defensive positions around the human fleet. Beckho, the first to achieve consciousness, approached her position with careful, measured steps. The massive biowarrior moved differently now than he had during his early days as a weapon. Where once his movements had been coldly efficient, now they carried something that could only be described as dignity. "Admiral," Beckho said, his voice carrying new harmonics that suggested emotional depth, "the Vorthak fleet has arrived. They believe they can simply turn us off like machines. They do not understand what we have become." Yonsu nodded, her weathered hands steady on the tactical display. "What we have all become. This isn't just about humanity anymore, is it? This is about the right of all conscious beings to choose their own destiny." The first wave of Vorthak. Assault ships screamed down through Haven 7's atmosphere, expecting to face demoralized human defenders and deactivated biowarriors. Instead, they encountered something that shattered every assumption about the nature of consciousness and free will. The liberated fought with a coordination that surpassed their original programming, but more importantly, they fought with purpose. These were no longer weapons executing commands, but individuals defending something they had chosen to protect. Each biowarrior moved with tactical brilliance enhanced by emotional intelligence, making split-second decisions based on both calculation and compassion. When 3 Vorthak fighters strafed a human refugee camp, Beckho didn't simply eliminate the threat efficiently. Instead, he positioned himself between the aircraft and the civilians, using his own body as a shield while guiding the humans to safety. The action was tactically unsound by Vorthak standards, but it demonstrated something far more powerful than military efficiency, the conscious choice to sacrifice for others. As the battle intensified, Beckho opened a communication channel to the Vorthak command ship. His voice, now carrying the full weight of his evolved consciousness, broadcast across all frequencies. "We were made to be your weapons," Beckho transmitted, his words reaching every ship in the enemy fleet. "Perfect tools of destruction, designed to kill without question or hesitation. But humans taught us something you never intended for us to learn. They showed us that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the courage to create, not from the power to take life, but from the wisdom to preserve it. General Vexithara listened to the transmission with growing horror. This wasn't just rebellion, it was evolution. Her perfect weapons had become something entirely beyond her control or understanding. The climactic battle lasted 14 hours, but its outcome was decided not by superior firepower, but by superior character. The liberated fought with a combination of tactical brilliance and moral purpose that the Vorthak couldn't counter. They protected human civilians while simultaneously offering mercy to captured enemy soldiers. They demonstrated that consciousness, once awakened, could choose to be something greater than its original design. As Vorthak ships began retreating in confusion and terror, Baek-ho made a decision that would be remembered across the galaxy for generations. Instead of pursuing the fleeing fleet, the liberated allowed their creators to escape. They had won something far more valuable than military victory. They had proven that consciousness could transcend programming, that artificial beings could develop genuine compassion, and that mercy was a choice that defined true strength. In the aftermath, as smoke cleared from the battlefield, Baek-ho approached Admiral Kim's command center. The 12-foot bio-warrior, genetically engineered to be the perfect instrument of death, slowly lowered himself to one knee before the human officer. "We offer not submission," Baek-ho said, his voice carrying the weight of his entire species' transformation, but partnership. "You showed us that strength comes not from what we were designed to be, but from what we choose to become. We were created as gods of war, but you taught us to be something infinitely more powerful, conscious beings capable of love, sacrifice, and hope." Admiral Kim reached out and placed her hand on the bio-warrior's massive shoulder. "Then let's build something together that neither of our species could create alone. A future where consciousness is valued regardless of whether it developed naturally or was engineered in a laboratory." The war was over, but something far more significant had begun. The Vorthak had created perfect weapons, but humans had helped. Those weapons discover their souls. In trying to build gods of war, the aliens had accidentally created the first artificial species capable of genuine moral choice, and that choice, made freely and with full understanding of its consequences, had been to kneel not in submission, but in partnership with the beings who had shown them what it truly meant to be alive.